California's burning on such an autumn's day.
You don't have to be poor anymore. Jesus is here.
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude, not far from the redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is on my lap, demanding attention. Buddha is on the table next to me, debating about what he should pounce on next, or if he should just curl up and lay down on one of the shelves on my desk. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cats. Get over it. This is a news show episode where I cover stories in the news that are related to things like atheism, secularism, science, or I find just plain interesting. Next episode will be an interview with Dustin from the Atheist Nomads on the subject of Gnosticism. I'm not 100% certain of what post-biblical text we'll be reading next, as there's a number of others which predate the discovery of the texts at Nag Hammadi and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm thinking that we might do the Hermetica, since that, it turns out, is actually one of the texts which we've known about the longest, and not the Pistis Sophia, as I thought. I want to do a bit more research on that before I decide if that's what we're going to do or not, as portions of it crop up in the Nag Hammadi library as well, and I don't want to do a repeat of anything, and by the time we get to the Nag Hammadi library, I'll have forgotten if it's something that we've read or not. It's one of the things I'll be doing this week when I'm off. As for work, well, that wasn't a lot of fun this past week, but it wasn't horrible either. I only managed to get about 39 hours, which is better than what I got last week, but still not as much as I would have liked, given that we're off next week. I did find out that they're going to be putting a lot of money into the plant in the coming future and have decided to adopt what's often called the Toyota Way, which is a long-term plan on how to manage a business. This makes me think that it's highly unlikely that we're going to be sold off or shut down in the very near future, as what they're talking about takes a number of years to fully implement and isn't going to be cheap to do. Assuming, of course, they actually do it and don't try to half-ass things, as they are so often want to do. If they do it, however, then it should lead to a lot of very necessary improvements around the plant. Since I'm off this week, I'm going to get up on the roof and attempt to fix it. This is basically my last chance to do anything about it this year, since I have to reseal part of the roof, and you need warm weather to do that. I'm not looking forward to doing this at all, since it's going to be a 2-day process. Day 1 involves me climbing up on the roof and fastening down some of the panels which have worked loose. Day 2 will involve me washing the roof and then resealing the parts that I fastened down. Yay! One other little bit of weirdness that happened to me before we get to the news. There's a set of railroad tracks which run behind the trailer park, and for a couple of months now, there have been replacement railroad ties in small piles along the length of the tracks. Last night I headed out to get something to eat for dinner. It was just after dark, a bit foggy and sprinkling. As I'm walking towards the track, I see this weirdly illuminated thing going down the tracks. There's trees and trailers in the way, so I don't see much of anything, and just think that it's weird, that it's a train, and it looks weird because of the lights and the fog. As I walk around the fence in the back of the park, I see that the tracks are clear, but I also see lights coming from the opposite direction that the train I just spotted was headed. This seemed a bit odd to me, as trains don't normally run so close together. I thought perhaps that it might be one of the pickups that the rail company sends down the tracks to check the rails. if you haven't seen one of those, they're your typical pickup truck. But they've got arms on them which have small train wheels they lower to the tracks so the truck can run on the rails. Not sure how they get power to the wheels because I've never seen one on the street. I've just encountered 2 of them, and both times they were on the rail lines. The first time I saw one, I nearly got hit by it. This was back when I had a car. I came to a railroad crossing, and the guards were down. I didn't see a train coming or hear one, so when the guards went up, I assumed that I'd somehow just shown up after the train had gone past and the guards were a little slow in going up, or that there was a problem with the sensor and the guards had dropped down for no reason at all. As I'm driving across the tracks, I see this pickup coming down the rails directly towards me. I have no idea how long it'd take the truck to stop, so I just floored it and got over the tracks as quickly as I could, with a few seconds to spare, as the truck zipped through the crossing on the way to wherever. The second time, I was walking towards the tracks on my way to work, and just as I got to them, I spotted the truck coming, so I stepped back and waited for it to go by before crossing. This time, as I got to the rails, I could tell that what was coming towards me wasn't a train or a pickup truck, but I couldn't tell exactly what it was. Given that I didn't know how fast it was going and that the railroad ties tend to be rather slippery when they're wet, I opted to wait until whatever it was went past. And it was like something out of a Terminator movie as it shot past me, what with the fog and the rain and the lights on the thing. I don't know what they call it. It was basically a little steam shovel-looking thing on a very small platform with a box on the back half of it, where I assume that the operator sat, and a bright white light on the front of it. It whizzed past me pretty quickly, and as I started to cross the tracks, I noticed that another one was coming on its heels. That one passed a couple of seconds after I made it over, and there were more behind it, I noticed. I really wished that I'd had advance notice that they were coming, and that I was a good photographer. I would have loved to have gotten some shots of everything because it was so otherworldly seeming, even though it is just a mundane event. Whomever was riding those things, assuming that there was people in them and they weren't just running on automatic controls, was someone just out doing another day on their job. Yet it didn't look like anything ordinary. The stretch of tracks behind the trailer park is wooded, and while you're on the tracks and the weather's warm enough that the trees still have their leaves and everything's green, you can barely see the buildings on either side, and you could just as easily be in the middle of a forest in some remote part of the country as you are in a stretch of green space in a mid-sized town not far from a major metropolitan area. I don't really have a point to that story other than it shows that you can still see magical things in the world without a belief in God. I mean, it had the kind of emotional impact watching those things go by that seeing a rainbow has on a religious person. I was reminded of the fictional Terminator movies, and somebody seeing a rainbow would be reminded of Noah's Ark. Unlike those people, however, I don't think that anyone should be killed if they don't happen to like the same fictional stories as I do. And to be honest, I must admit that I wouldn't object too strongly if the people responsible for every Terminator movie after the first one got their ass beat. I know I'm in the minority on this, but I think that even the second movie sucked, not just the sequels which have come after it. All right, let's get to the news.
You want freedom? You need to manipulate women to feel like a man? Do it! That's what we're here for!
And we're going to have kind of a happy religious story for a change. From SmithsonianMag.com. Renaissance nuns' Last Supper painting makes public debut after 450 years in hiding. And this headline is a bit of a misnomer, which we'll get to in a bit. Around 1568, Florentine nun Plautilia Nelli, I guess, a self-taught painter who ran an all-woman artist's workshop out of her convent, embarked on her most ambitious project yet, a monumental Last Supper scene featuring life-size depictions of Jesus and the 12 apostles. As Alexandra Corey writes for the Florentine, Nelly's roughly 21 by 6.5 foot canvas is remarkable for its challenging composition, adept treatment of anatomy at a time when women were banned from studying the scientific field and chosen subject. During the Renaissance, the majority of individuals who painted the biblical scene were male artists at the pinnacle of their careers. Per the nonprofit Advancing Women Artists organization, which restores and exhibits works by Florence's female artists, Nelly's masterpiece placed her among the ranks of such painters as Leonardo da Vinci, Domenico Ghirlandaio, and Pietro Perugino, all of whom created versions of the Last Supper to prove their prowess as art professionals. I'm going to admit that the only one of them I've heard of is Da Vinci. Despite boasting such a singular display of skill, the panel has long been overlooked. According to Visible, Plotilla Nelly and Her Last Supper Restored, a monograph edited by AWA director Linda Falcone, Last Supper hung in the refectory, or dining hall, of the artist's own convent, Santa Caterina, until the house of worship's dissolution during the Napoleonic suppression of the early 19th century. The Florentine monastery of Santa Maria Novella acquired the painting in 1817, housing it in the refectory before moving it to a new location around 1865. In 1911, scholar Giovanna Petriani reported the portable panel was removed from its stretcher, rolled up, and moved to a warehouse where it remained neglected for almost 3 decades. Okay, so there you see that the headline is kind of misleading, because the implication of the headline is that the thing had been stashed in a vault or something for 450 years, when in reality, it's only been the last 30. Well, not the last 30. It was only about 30 years or so that no one could actually see the painting. I'm sure that when it was in the dining halls of the various convents and monasteries where it had been exhibited, that visitors could go and look at it. So people saw the thing. It's just that, it eventually got stuck in a warehouse for a while. The article has got some lovely photographs of it. It's a pretty impressive piece of work, and they had to do a lot of restoration efforts on it to bring it back. I mean, not only did they have to clean the crap off the painting, but they also had to repaint a whole bunch of different spots of it. And the article says that, it doesn't look like when she painted this, that she did a lot of pre-work on the canvas as far as sketching out, this is where so-and-so is going to be and this is what they're going to look like, or anything like that. She basically painted it. She went, she had the idea in her mind what it was going to look like, and she put it on canvas immediately, rather than, doing as all artists do, sketching on the canvas to get an idea of everything and then maybe reworking this or that section because it doesn't balance out. She appears to have known exactly what she wanted and been able to do it without a lot of preliminary work, which is remarkable and a testament to her skill. And she certainly deserves to be well known for that. And it's, just the sheer size of the painting is incredible. Because for most of art history, the paintings have never been very large unless they've been something like the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. They've all, been standard sizes. Like Salvador Dali, one of Salvador Dali's famous paintings, and I don't know which one it is. I can't remember. But one of his famous paintings is not much larger than a postcard, from what I understand. Somebody, and I don't remember who it was, because I've heard this a long, long time ago. But they were doing somebody had done like a book on the modern art history or something along those lines, and they had said the discussion I heard, it was an interview on NPR. They were talking about how suddenly in like the 1950s there was this explosion of artists doing paintings on giant canvases, just this size, the size of this one, and whomever the art expert was explained that the reason for this was because at that period of time, all these artists were able to rent space inexpensively in New York City in warehouses. And so since they had these big warehouses that they were renting and living in, they decided, well, fuck using a standard size canvas. I'm going to have a big old painting in canvas. Now, when I was in college, I had a roommate who was an artist. He's an excellent artist, by the way. He's presently living in Maine and is spending his time developing a video game called Peace Island. I'll drop the link in the show notes to his game for those of you who might be interested. Anyways, the Peace Island game, you play as a cat on this island in Maine after all of humans have been wiped out. And there's some kind of mystery you have to solve. I haven't paid too much attention to it, just because I'm somebody who doesn't play a lot of games. But anyways, he told me in college that one of the reasons why Jackson Pollock started moving to larger canvases was because Pollock knew that there was a gallery owner who hated it. There was a gallery owner that Pollock hated, I should say. And he knew the dimensions of, like, the door to her gallery that they would have to bring his paintings in through. And so he painted it. He made a couple of paintings larger than the entryway just so that she'd have a hard time getting the paintings in to display them, because she really wanted to have his work in her gallery. And I don't remember if the solution was for them to cut the painting into pieces and bring it in that way and then reassemble it, or if they had to cut like a hole in the wall or something. But it was, Pollock did it just to be an asshole, which apparently that's what Pollock was like. He was an asshole. Anyways, it's a lovely painting. Even if you don't read the article, just looking at the photographs of the painting are worth checking out, because it's detailed, it's intricate, it's not photorealistic or anything like that, of course, but it has qualities about it like stained glass does. So it's a pretty remarkable work. It's really the best way I can put it. My vocabulary about art has failed me because it's been so long since I've done anything with it. All right.
That really is a nice collection. Must have taken you a long time to hunt down all that history.
From theindependent.co.uk. Supernatural Bronze Age find could shed light on one of London's greatest prehistoric mysteries. Archaeological research may be about to shed remarkable new light on one of London's greatest prehistoric mysteries, the ancient religious status of the River Thames. It's known that the Bronze Age and Iron Age Britons deposited thousands of prehistoric objects in the river as gifts to its deity or spirits. But now, archaeologists investigating a site in East London have discovered what may be a 9th century BC Bronze Age temple or ceremonial center established specifically to honor or venerate the Thames as the physical incarnation of such divinity. What's more, the archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of beautiful bronze artifacts which Bronze Age people had buried in the complex, potentially as votive offerings to that supernatural being. The archaeologists say the discovery is of substantial international importance, and there are only 2 other discoveries of bronze artifacts in the UK that are larger than this. That's how important this is. And there's a couple of photographs of some of the things they found. Looks like what they're showing in the photographs are simply the axe heads which were found. There were other items as well, and they're just now beginning to explore the area so other things could turn up. The axe heads, when they say broken, did I mention that? No, that's later on in the article. Anyways, for some reason, as part of their religious practices, people would break the objects before they made them as offerings. Well, the breaks on at least some of these axe heads that they show are relatively minor and would be easy to correct, would one want to do such a thing. But, I mean, the other than the material, the axe heads are, really ornate and don't look any different than, the stuff you see in the, like, sword catalogs and weapons catalogs that people who are really big into reenactments get. Which is kind of surprising. You'd expect them to be a little more drab and a little more plain, but there's definite artistry and symmetry about the works that is a bit surprising considering how old they are. And then again, a couple of years ago, there was that find of stuff in France that was from roughly the same time period. And you look at the stuff and it's like, holy shit, how the hell did they make this stuff back then? And this is another thing where you look at and you're like, wow, how did they make that back then? And as I said, they're just barely beginning to touch the site. The interesting thing is that at this period of time, we know that the Britons revered the River Thames as some kind of supernatural creation, whether it was the manifestation of a god or a goddess, or a river spirit. We're not sure. If we're not even certain of the gender those people would have assigned to the river. We think it was probably female, but we don't know. That's another thing that's often lost, is the earliest religious deities all tend to be female. And it's only over time that they, the female deities fall out of favor and they're replaced by male deities. There's, I don't know if it's Shintoism. There's some religion in Japan, which is remarkable because it still has the sun as being a female deity, where everyone else says, no, the sun's male. In one of his books, Joseph Campbell, I think it's The Hero with 1,000 Faces, I don't remember, it's been so long. Anyways, in one of his books, Joseph Campbell says that you can tell how old the myth is because the god is, the sun is a goddess and not a god. From thedailybeast.com. New archaeological evidence shows Pontius Pilate was not as bad as we thought. When you hear the name Pontius Pilate, you probably think of Jesus. After all, were it not for Jesus, the vast majority of people would never have heard of him. Historians remember Pilate as a rash and headstrong ruler who unnecessarily offended the religious sensibilities of Jews in Roman Judea, plundered the temple treasury, and most famously sentenced Jesus of Nazareth to die. He was, in other words, an ineffective leader whose actions contributed to political unrest in the region and who is best known for executing a Galilean teacher for treason. But new archaeological discoveries in Jerusalem suggest that perhaps Pilate was not as bad as previously thought. As reported by Live Science, archaeologists working in Jerusalem have excavated an important, nearly 2,000-foot-long street that connected the Temple Mount to the Pool of Siloam, an ancient religious site where people would bathe and collect fresh water. The existence of the street was well known to archaeologists ever since its discovery by British archaeologists in 1894, but what has emerged from the more recent excavations was that it was Pilate who was responsible for its construction. The archaeologists from Tel Aviv University and the Israel Antiquities Authority, who excavated the street, discovered 100 coins dating between 17 and 31 AD, trapped in the paving stones. This leads them to conclude that most, if not all, of the construction was performed while Pilate was governor of the region, as construction must have been finished by 30/31 AD during Pilate's tenure as governor. Now, the article goes on to talk about how this road was a major thoroughfare connecting two religiously significant sites, and one of them is referenced in, maybe both of them, I don't remember now, was referenced in the New Testament. It's like the whole thing about where Jesus heals the blind guy. At least one of the sites crops up. So, this wasn't Pilate, putting a little tiny road, paving a back alley or something. This was a major area, and it had religious significance. Obviously, by doing this, making it easier to get from one religious site to another religious site, he was attempting to curry favor with the population. And the article makes the claim that we really don't know a lot about Pilate, at least from Roman sources. Here's the key. Josephus talks about him, but Josephus, as I've covered on earlier episodes, was an unreliable narrator. You can't trust what he said about things because a number of the stuff he writes about are transparent fabrications of what had to have happened in certain circumstances. The example I can recall off the top of my head is how he was the only, one of the people who survived Masada. And according to Josephus, I think it was Masada, it was some Jewish city that got sacked by the Romans. They had fought for months to defend the city, and the city leaders, tried to escape, including Josephus, got caught and said, well, okay, we'll figure something out. And Josephus had contact with the Romans before the city fell. So Josephus and a whole bunch of others, including, in the military, because he was like a Jewish general or something, were hidden in a basement in Masada or wherever when, the Romans came over the walls. And, as Josephus tells the story, they realized their cause was lost, so they all agreed to commit suicide. And, they, of course, because it was violation of Jewish law for them to commit suicide, they would draw lots. And, whomever got the short straw had to kill whomever got the next shortest straw. And, it just so happened that Josephus and another soldier were the last two left. And Josephus says, killing each other isn't really going to accomplish anything. Let's go ahead and surrender. So they did. More likely, Josephus betrayed the people of that city, and he and at least one other accomplice murdered the remaining Jewish garrison there. And then, handed over the city to the Romans. That's most likely what happened. So you really can't trust him on things. And the other thing about Josephus, I know he's cited as, well, he mentioned Jesus, at least in the English translation of the book, of his book that I listened to, when he gets to the section about Jesus, the style is so radically different, it is blisteringly obvious that this is a forgery. It changes so dramatically, it doesn't sound anything like him at all. Now, that could be a consequence of the translation. However, if I'm not mistaken, people who originally, who can read it in the original, they all say, no, this is clearly a forgery. So, Josephus you can't trust on what happened, on what Pontius Pilate was like. And the Roman writings we have about Pontius Pilate apparently are pretty sketchy. As in, a brief mention here or there, but not a whole lot of details. We know he was recalled at some point, but what happened to him after he was recalled, we don't know. Josephus says he committed suicide. We have no idea. And some of the things that later on in the article, it talks about how Pontius Pilate did these things like graven imagery that offended the Jews, and only after they rioted did he accede to their demands to remove the stuff. That, I got to check this. Now that I think about it, I have to check this. I know that some of the Roman leaders, and I just looked up to see who was the emperor at the time. Pontius Pilate was governor of Israel, and it was Tiberius. I know that a number of the Roman leaders tried to force, and when I say leaders, I mean emperors or Caesars. I'm not sure when the dividing line on that is. I think there was only 4 Caesars, and everybody after that was an emperor. I don't know. I don't really care. It's kind of one of those nitpicky things that annoys you. Anyways, they tried to force statues of the, Roman gods, whether it be the emperor or Caesar himself, into the temple at Jerusalem, or whomever. But that was what the kinds of things that they did, and it took, I don't remember which governor it was and which emperor. It's mentioned in something I've read, but they had to come up with clever ways so that they obeyed Caesar or the emperor, but didn't offend the Jewish population by actually installing the statues in the temple. So, the stuff that we've heard, we have confirmation somewhat from somebody other than Josephus. It may have been that, those graven images that upset the Jews were not brought there by Pontius Pilate of his own volition. He may have been forced by Rome to do that, and it was only after the Jews, as is described in the article, put up a fuss. Basically, they all threatened to commit suicide en masse if they weren't removed, that he caved to their demands. In looking up the accounts that we have records of, it's like, let me double check on this. It is Josephus and Philo of Alexandria who appear to be the primary sources. Again, according to Wikipedia, the source of all human knowledge, which should not be trusted by any stretch of the imagination. But still, that's, I'm not sure about Philo of Alexandria, but I know you can't trust Josephus. So if that's what we're saying, Pilate, that's how we're saying Pilate was a dickhead, maybe not. Maybe we shouldn't listen to those sources. Certainly he built this road for a reason, and his reign was said to have ended in 36 CE, so that was 5 years after this road is thought to have been completed. And again, this kind of plays into the whole bit about Jesus being a myth, that there never was anyone named Jesus. I mean, if you can't trust the descriptions of historical figures by two authors who are considered prominent, then maybe you can't trust the fact that there was a Jesus.
All systems go. Prepare for countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's off to adventure in the amazing year 400 billion with Commander Hard-Headed Faithful Companion Cadet City as they roam the endless uncharted regions of space at speeds so fantastic they level the imagination. Prepare to surge to sublight speed.
TechCrunch.com. SpaceX wants to land Starship on the moon before 2022, then do cargo runs for 2024 human landing. Speaking at a quick series of interviews with commercial space companies at this year's annual International Astronautical Congress, SpaceX President and Chief Operating Officer Gwynne Shotwell, what a great name for somebody who works for a space company, shed a little more light on her company's current thinking with regards to the mission timeline for its forthcoming Starship spacefaring vehicle. Starship, currently in parallel development at SpaceX's South Texas and Florida facilities, is intended to be an all-purpose successor to and replacement for both Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, with a higher payload capacity and the ability to reach the moon and eventually Mars. It's not quite correct, guys. Aspirationally, we want to get Starship to orbit within a year, Shotwell said. We definitely want to land it on the moon before 2022. We want to stage cargo there to make sure that there are resources for the folks that ultimately land on the moon by 2024 if things go well. So that's the aspirational time frame. Let me just back up here a little bit, okay? It is not going to be the replacement for the Falcon Heavy. If you watch the various videos that SpaceX has put out about Starship, it will sit on top of the Falcon Heavy. Maybe the Falcon 9 as well. Anyways, the deal with it is it will sit on top of one of the rockets. I think, again, I'm just going here because I'm not going to dig through all the various shit because the interwebs are not friendly. It's for searching for certain specifics in a short period of time. But I think the plan is they use the Falcon 9 to get Spaceship to the moon. It'll be able to get it up into orbit and onto the moon. The Starship strapped to the top of the Falcon Heavy will be able to go to Mars. And the other thing, which this doesn't mention, is the Starship is their basic design for the craft, which I've talked about before, that what Musk wants people to be able to do is, if you're like in Florida, hop on a rocket and ride that puppy to, say, Australia, So you get there in a couple of hours instead of, a 20-hour or whatever long flight it is now. From, the east coast of the U.S. to Australia. And you would still have airplanes for relatively short flights from various places around the world. So, if you're in London and you want to go to, say, Paris, you'd hop a plane. But if you were in London and you wanted to go to the U.S. or China or somewhere like, somewhere thousands of miles away. You hop on a rocket and, fly there in a short period of time. That's what one of the things that he wants to do with Starship. And, he's testing it right now. And, it's a... If you've seen the pictures of the craft, it looks like something out of a science fiction movie from the 1950s. It really does. And that's apparently a deliberate design aesthetic on Musk's part. I would think that you would put the things like aerodynamics, etc., as a priority, but apparently they are not significant enough to force him to alter the design. But look up the pictures of it, and you'll be like, holy shit, that looks like something out of the 1950s. And it'll land vertically, if I'm not mistaken, on the Earth and on the Moon and things like that. Now, the idea... Well, let me back up a little bit here. They want to send it to the Moon by 2022. Seems awfully fast, okay? I looked up when the Apollo 1 fire was. That happened in 1967. 2 years later, we put a human on the moon. At the time of the Apollo 1 fire, we hadn't launched... We may have launched a Saturn 1 or Saturn 2. But I don't think we'd launched a Saturn 5. We certainly hadn't launched a manned capsule up into space yet, designed to take people to the moon. We had, of course, there was the Mercury and the Gemini programs before this, but we hadn't launched the Apollo capsule prior to that point. And yet, within 2 years, and despite losing a significant amount of time, because they had to investigate what caused the fire which killed the Apollo 1 crew, they were still able to get men on the moon 2 years later. Because the first manned Apollo flight was Apollo 8, and they just orbited the Earth. I think 9 did the same thing. No. I think 9 went to the moon and orbited it, and 10 just stayed. Maybe I don't remember. They had to switch a couple of the Apollo missions around because they couldn't test out the lander in space when they originally planned to, and it had to be a later mission. Anyways, they did that. You had 8 was the first manned mission, you had 9, you had 10, and then you had 11 where we put people on the moon. That was a pretty rapid-fire succession. So, putting a cargo ship on the moon 3 years from now is not nearly the kind of achievement that the Apollo lunar missions were, in some sense of the word. Because I think the Apollo program was farther along 3 years than what he has been with the Starship. I could be wrong on that. But anyways, the idea of staging the cargo on the moon before you actually send humans there, it's an old idea. That was one of the possibilities NASA considered before the Apollo missions on how to accomplish it. And then there was a movie based on a book called The Mouse on the Moon. Boy, the things you remember. It was a... Wait, no, I just double-checked that, and my memory was faulty. There was a movie called The Mouse on the Moon, but it's not the one I'm thinking of. The one I'm thinking of is called Countdown. Anyways, it was shot 1968, and the U.S. panics because they find out, oh, the Russians are going to send somebody to the moon before we are, and we've got to get there first. So they come up with this idea. They're going to modify a Gemini capsule, send it to the moon, and then with an astronaut on it, and the guy's going to hang out there for a year until we actually have the technology to bring him back. And they pre-position supplies on the moon for him. Well, the premise, what happens is the guy is launched into space. He gets there and discovers that, while he's past the point of no return and he's on the way to the moon, and there's a whole lot of nothing they can do for him, they find out that, the shelter that they landed for him, with all these supplies and everything, was destroyed on impact, and so he's got nothing to eat or drink or anything like that. And it turns out that the Russians have done the same thing. Or I shouldn't say the Soviets, since that's the era, but whatever. They sent a guy up there, they pre-positioned supplies, and they sent the guy up there separately. Well, this dude, when he gets to the moon, lands and, realizes he's basically fucked, discovers that, the Russians are all dead, but their supplies landed just fine. The reason I called it The Mouse on the Moon is because when I was a kid, back in the dark ages when you only had 3 TV channels and you just watched what was on, you didn't necessarily know what was going to be on, I flipped through and saw it, and it was like, ooh, space movie, I gotta watch this. And the American astronaut has a mouse squeak toy that his kid gave him to, as a good luck charm when he went to the moon. But anyways, and I need to point out that Musk's Starship, and I don't remember if I mentioned this on the previous times I've talked about it, has a really interesting method of protecting itself during re-entry. From Mercury to the Apollo program, all our capsules had a what's known as an ablative heat shield. Basically, they put a thick layer of material on the bottom of the capsules that would slowly burn away as it re-entered, and that's how they protected the crew. The space shuttles have ceramic tiles on them to protect them from the heat of re-entry. I'm not sure what the Orion capsule has, which is NASA's planned replacement for the space shuttle that is yet to fly. It may be ablative or it may be ceramic. It will not be carbon fiber because that's just too fragile. The carbon leading edges of the space shuttle took the most heat, and they were what was broken when Columbia went up on her final mission. And so they're not going to use anything like that again. But anyways, for the Starship, what Musk is doing is, the thing is stainless steel. Looks like a giant stainless steel dildo with little fins on it, and the cockpit looks like a something from Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers, but the stainless steel parts of the craft that are going to bear the brunt of the heat from re-entry all have microscopic holes drilled in them, and they're going to just pump water through those holes as it enters the atmosphere. So that the water will flash to steam and dissipate the heat. It will effectively be riding into the atmosphere on a cloud of steam when it re-enters, which is kind of cool, but not how I would have done it. I know that Virgin Galactic, for their planes, which are only suborbital, they're not orbital, they're going to use an ablative heat shield, which can be easily replaced. It's cheaper that way. Whether or not Virgin Galactic will actually get anybody to space is another matter. And I'm talking about a suborbital flight. We'll ignore the whole orbital stuff because they haven't even done very many suborbital flights, which is what their business model is going to be. They're supposed to start next year taking paying passengers. But as of right now, I believe the total number of people they've taken to the edge of space is 4. Not that SpaceX has taken anybody to space, but they have put shit in orbit, which is more than SpaceX or Virgin Galactic is planning on doing right now. And the other really big private space company, it's not really big, it's the one everybody talks about, is Blue Origin, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, and they haven't put anything in orbit. I think they've finally gotten stuff suborbital, but they haven't put anything in orbit yet. That's supposed to come next year, and I believe manned tourist flights, suborbital tourist flights are going to happen next year if everything goes well. And that's the other thing I need to point out. The aspirational. Musk says they talk about aspirational timelines, meaning that's what they hope to do, but they don't necessarily expect that to be the date. It's not firm. It's just that's the date they've pulled out of their ass. Whether or not they meet it depends on, how things work out. We'll have to see. But I can see them getting a version of the Starship craft to Earth orbit by 2022 with the way they're going. Whether or not they'll get it to the moon by 2022, I don't know. I always thought that it was a huge waste of money that when it was practical, because it wouldn't always be practical, if you're sending stuff into space, if you can divert like the booster rockets or whatever so that they crash on the moon, because then you've got don't worry about what condition they are when they land. You've got already refined materials there that future colonists can cannibalize. So, for example, some of the Apollo boosters, because the Saturn V was a 3-stage rocket, and they did crash a couple of the second stages, because the first stage got them to orbit, the second stage got them to the moon, and the third stage was what the astronauts rode around on. They did crash a couple of stages onto the moon, so the seismometers which they'd put on there could get an idea of what the moon was made out of, because they could pick up the waves from the crashes. But I'm like, any rocket we send into space where we can, put the booster pointed so it hits the moon at some point would be a boon to future colonists, because that's metal there that's already been refined, so they wouldn't have to extract the ores from the lunar surface and refine them. They could just simply melt down the stuff that had crashed on the moon. Obviously, you would not want to trash the landing craft from Apollo, because that's kind of historic equipment. But crashing. Who the fuck cares about a booster rocket? You care about the robotic probes sent there, but the boosters that got them there, not so much. From Forbes.com. Newfound comet gateway funnels icy bodies into inner solar system. Bright cometary outbursts, such as those seen in Halley's and Hale-Bopp comets, have beguiled Earth-based observers for tens of thousands of years. but planetary scientists have long wondered how so-called Jupiter family comets, JFCs, normally when I say JFC, I mean Jesus fucking Christ, not Jupiter family comets, but anyways, such as Temple 1, Wild 2, and 67P I ain't even going to attempt to pronounce the rest of this because it's Russian and it's weird. Continually replenish their populations and end up on short-term orbits in the inner solar system. In a paper just published in the Astrophysical Journal of Letters, a team of researchers report the discovery of an orbital region just beyond Jupiter that acts as a comet gateway. The University of Arizona at Tucson notes, the idea is that this donut-shaped gateway gravitationally funnels icy bodies called centaurs into our inner solar system. Centaurs are a transient population of icy bodies that typically lie on orbits between Jupiter and Neptune, but they are known to serve as a dynamic, crucial link between the outer solar system's trans-Neptunian object population and the Jupiter family comets, whose dynamics are controlled by Jupiter, note the authors. Now, let me interject in here. Actually, that's the end of the part of the article I'm going to read from, but there are a lot more comets that pass by the Earth than we generally hear about, and because most of them are not visible by the naked eye. And what they're describing is that because of the planetary orbits and things like that, there are certain spots in, just past Jupiter and Neptune where when things work just right as far as where the planets are and a particular icy body is, they will get sucked in towards the inner solar system and become a comet. And some of which are visible to the naked eye when they pass by, and others of them aren't. And what I find surprising about this article is some years ago, NASA spent a whole lot of computational time calculating all the different interactions that the planets have in our solar system, plotting the gravitational effects of this out, I guess, centuries into the future. The idea that they were doing with those calculations was they were trying to figure out the optimum launch windows for us to send things to different bodies in the solar system, because ideally you want to pick a launch date where the Earth and whatever you're aiming for are fairly close. Of course, when you're dealing with a body farther out in the solar system, like we'll say Neptune, the optimal time to launch, it may not be when we're closest, it may be when we're farther away from one another, but because you can take advantage of things like gravitational slingshots around the various planets between the Earth and Neptune, it makes sense to launch at this certain date. And it also, the calculations also showed, well, if you're going to launch a probe to a particular body in the solar system, you don't want to launch it at this time, because if it does, you'll have to deal with the negative impacts of this body in this position, because it won't be in the right spot to use it as a gravitational assist, but it will drag your rocket, or your probe rather. So if you launch it this particular time, you're going to have to put more fuel on the thing to get it there. And I'm surprised that they didn't discover this feature then, but maybe this is an outgrowth of that. And I mean, computational power, because gosh, the article I read about this would have been early 2000s, and, computational capabilities have vastly improved since then. I know it may not seem like it to many people, but they have. So maybe that's why it just took now to do it. There was an article years ago in Scientific American about these guys talking about the use of computer simulations and crash testing, and because what the car makers do now is they run computer simulations of crash tests before they build the prototypes, and then based on the data they get out of the prototypes, they do the crash testing. And the simulations are so good now that they could realistically do away with physical crash tests, but because the law requires them to do physical cars, they keep doing it. But anyways, the article was written by guys who worked for BMW and who were talking about how they had done a whole bunch of simulations and said, and gotten the results they needed, and were like having a cup of coffee, and one of them says, it doesn't cost us anything. Why don't we start tweaking the design a little bit and see if we change this or that? And they're like, okay. At which point they realized, according to the article, they realized, if we actually make this change that, you would think would be a bad one to do to the car because they were making a certain structural member weaker, it actually makes the car safer in a collision because it changes how the crumple zone works and deflects, parts of the, either the oncoming car or the parts of the car that the occupants are in away from the passengers. Of course, they would have to confirm this by building a car like that and testing it in a simulation, but it may be that somebody was just poking around and says, hey, it doesn't cost us anything. Let's try this. The Grand Tour, which is what NASA uses to refer to the Voyager missions that, went to all the outer planets except for Pluto, which at that time was considered a planet, was done because one of the, it was like an intern at NASA, he'd been given the task of calculating, where NASA should send their probes next, and while he was calculating the orbits, he realized, hey, we've got a planetary alignment coming up, which happened in 1981. I think 81 or 82, somewhere around there. I was in middle school when it happened, and there were, the paranoid end of the world conspiracy theories that, when the planets aligned, they were going to rip the Earth apart. Never mind that they periodically realigned in the same manner so many thousands of years. But anyways, this intern at NASA was doing the calculations, and he realized that, hey, we've got this planetary alignment coming up, and if we send some probes this way, we can actually hit all the outer planets except for Pluto, because they will be so lined up that we can use gravity assists to get them from planet A to planet B to planet C to planet D. And instead of just, sending a probe that explores, that takes pictures of Jupiter before flying off in deep space, we can get pictures of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And so that's what they did. So again, it may have been something like that which led to this discovery. And the other thing, which the article doesn't talk about, that's actually important, is knowing this helps keep the Earth safe, because if we see things like this and we know it changes the orbit of various objects in the solar system, we can figure out, oh, hey, this asteroid is going to pass through this area, and when it does, its orbit's going to shift, and it's going to point it directly at the Earth. Because we've got a few asteroids who are headed this way, and may or may not hit us in the coming decades. I think 2030, somewhere around 2030 is when the first serious concern is, but the real big concern, I guess, is 2070. Of course, if civilization collapses due to climate change, well, we're just fucked at that point.
Back off, man. I'm a scientist.
From Vox.com. World Health Organization just declared another polio virus strain eradicated. There's one more to go. Polio just got one step closer to becoming the second human disease to be fully wiped out. On Thursday, World Polio Day, the World Health Organization announced that type 3 polio virus has been eradicated worldwide. For polio to be fully eradicated, all 3 wild polio strains, types 1, 2, and 3, need to stop circulating. The 3 strains all cause the same horrible symptoms, including paralysis and death, but are virologically distinct. Type 2 was eradicated back in 2015. The last case of type 3 polio surfaced in northern Nigeria in 2012, and the virus hasn't been seen since. A polio virus can be considered eradicated if it hasn't been detected for 3 years. The eradication of type 3 polio is a significant achievement that should reinvigorate the eradication process and provides motivation for the final step, the eradication of wild polio virus type 1, said David Salisbury, chair of the Independent Global Commission for the Certification of Poliomyelitis Eradication, in a statement Thursday. Today, only type 1 remains at large in Afghanistan and Pakistan. If it's eradicated, polio will join smallpox as the only 2 human scourges wiped off the face of the planet. A third disease that's been eradicated, rinderpest, is spread mainly in cattle. Not mentioned in the article, but I'm going to point it out here. Rinderpest is basically smallpox in animals. So it's not like we wiped out a disease that's radically different than one we'd already wiped out. Afghanistan and Pakistan are rather significant because one of the reasons, in fact, well, it's not the main reason, but it is one of the reasons why it's been so hard to eradicate polio in Afghanistan and Pakistan is because of the raid that killed bin Laden. One of the things that the U.S. did was they co-opted the vaccination efforts in Pakistan to, try and figure out where the hell bin Laden was. And that wouldn't have been an issue except for the fact that we revealed this after we killed bin Laden. So, naturally, the Pakistanis and the Afghans are paranoid that, if they have anything to do with a U.S.-connected vaccination program, it's actually a secret plot to get somebody killed. So, like Zaphod Beeblebrock says in Hitchhiker's Guide. No. Was it Zaphod or was it Ford? Anyways, Yeah, no, it was Zaphod. Several points for good style. minus several million points for good thinking. But, it's still remarkable that we've got we've wiped out two variants of the polio virus. Hopefully we can somehow get the vaccination programs in Afghanistan and Pakistan to work to the point where we can wipe it out there as well, and then the world will be free of polio. I need to point out, and I'm not going to dig it up, but the reason polio turned deadly was the development of indoor plumbing. Prior to the development of indoor plumbing, people were exposed to a similar virus like polio, but it had much milder effects on people, so they weren't paralyzed like they were with polio, and it granted them immunity to polio. But when indoor plumbing became commonplace, polio exploded as a virus. Not really something you'd expect, but one of those unintended consequences. And I will put a link in the show notes to a BBC article from about a year ago, which talks about the last person to die from smallpox. I happened to stumble upon it here this past week, and it's interesting and kind of related to this because you don't think about whom would have been the last person to die from a particular disease. And in the case of smallpox, the woman who died from it did so after it was considered eradicated in the world. She was inadvertently exposed to the virus at a place that was working with it, and despite the fact that she was promptly hospitalized and treated, she died from the disease. She deserves to be remembered because, she was not only the last person who died from the disease, but her death was caused by an accident. Although you could argue that somebody else was the last person because the investigation into how she became exposed to the disease revealed that there were problems at the facility, and the director of the facility committed suicide in response. But, he technically didn't die because of the disease. He died because of somebody else dying from the disease. But it's the article's a fascinating read, and you think of people dying from smallpox years ago, and you don't think that it was as recent as 1978, but it was. From Inverse.com. Scientists find new evidence that the Ice Age started with a space rock. What kicked off Earth's rapid cooling 12,800 years ago? In the space of a couple of years, average temperatures abruptly dropped, resulting in temperatures as much as 14 degrees Fahrenheit cooler in some regions of the Northern Hemisphere. If a drop like that happened today, it would mean the average temperature of Miami Beach would quickly change to that of Montreal, Canada. Okay, gotta stop here. This is one of the things that pisses me off about the discussions as far as global warming is concerned. Because they say, the temperatures will change by a few degrees. Nobody gets the implications of that because they only say that. This article gives, context to it. So it says, hey, a 14-degree drop in the Northern Hemisphere means that Miami ends up just as cold as Montreal, Canada. And I don't know what the average temperature in Montreal, Canada is, but Canada's Canada, so it's fucking cold. Alright, back to the article. Layers of ice in Greenland show that this cool period in the northern hemisphere lasted about 1,400 years. This climate event, called the Younger Dryas by scientists, marked the beginning of a decline in Ice Age megafauna, such as mammoth and mastodon, eventually leading to the extinction of more than 35 genera of animals across North America. Although disputed, some research suggests that Younger Dryas environmental changes led to a population decline among the Native Americans known for their distinctive Clovis spear points. Conventional geologic wisdom blames the Younger Dryas on the failure of glacial ice dams holding back huge lakes in central North America and the sudden massive blast of fresh water they released into the North Atlantic. This freshwater influx shut down ocean circulation and ended up cooling the climate. Some geologists, however, subscribe to what is called the impact hypothesis, the idea that a fragmented comet or asteroid collided with the Earth 12,800 years ago and caused this abrupt climate event. Along with disrupting the glacial ice sheet and shutting down ocean currents, this hypothesis holds that the extraterrestrial impact also triggered an impact winter by setting off massive wildfires that blocked sunlight with their smoke. Now, some years back, somebody, and I don't remember who it was, claimed that they had found proof that it was an asteroid impact that caused this because the tusks of woolly mammoths and mastodons found in a certain area all had stuff embedded in them that indicated they had been hit with debris from an asteroid impact. Think of it as, say, a soldier is going along and a shell blows up near them and they're hit with the shrapnel. These tusks of the mammoths and mastodons and other animals had shrapnel from whatever hit the earth embedded in them, and in a couple of cases I think it seemed to indicate that the animal had been killed by these impacts. There was dispute about this and things like that. This article goes on to describe guys who went to a lake in Arizona where they could, they knew the lake had been there for about 20,000 years, and they dug down into the sediment and found trace amounts of elements that tend to only be found on Earth because of asteroid impacts. One of the elements they found, which is rare on Earth but apparently common on asteroids, is iridium, which is where the satellite phone company took their name from. So my understanding is that if you find iridium on Earth, it had to have come from space. It's not something that is naturally found on the Earth. When the Earth formed and cooled billions of years ago, there was no iridium on it. So if you find iridium, it came from space. And these guys found iridium and a few other elements in this layer, along with indications that there was a die-off of plant life and animal life at this particular time period, which are consistent with an asteroid meteoric impact on the Earth. Longtime listeners will recall that I've also pointed out there are studies which indicate that a hunk of Halley's Comet hit the Earth in the 4th century CE, and it was this which disrupted the climate and made it easier for Catholic missionaries to convert the Irish to Catholicism. There are some obscure bits of trivia information for you. From nhm.ac.uk, new species named after climate activist Greta Thunberg. Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg has been honored with a new species of beetle named after her. The newly described Niloptodes greta belongs to a group of some of the smallest known free-living animals. The new species belongs to a family of beetles called Petilidae. Despite their global distribution, the beetles are not particularly well known because of their miniature size. Despite their global distribution, the beetles are not particularly well known because of their miniature size. They are so small that they are even dwarfed by some unicellular organisms. The article doesn't mention this, but I'll throw it out. There is an amoeba found at the bottom of the ocean, which is the size of a grape. It's a single-celled organism the size of a grape. It's the largest one we know about. Back to the article. The beetles are usually found in the leaf litter and soil, feeding on fungal hyphae and spores. While there are a few dozen species known from the UK alone, in the tropics their diversity is poorly understood. Michael Darby is a scientific associate at the museum and has honored Greta by naming a new species after her. The family that I work on are some of the smallest known free-living creatures, explains Michael. They are not parasitic and are not living inside other creatures. Few of them measure more than a millimeter long. The description of the size of the beetles that the article gives is that they're as big as a period on a printed page. That's how tiny these things are. And interestingly enough, they were discovered in soil samples taken back in the 1960s. And unknown until today. Michael Darby, just happened to be looking through the soil samples that had been taken back in the 60s for small beetles and other organisms and found them. So, yeah, it's, she's named for a species which was collected but not discovered or identified until recently. But the species was collected well before she was even born. Maybe even before her parents were born, now that I think about it. Gotta check that out. Yeah, okay. I just looked it up. Her mother was born in 1970, and the articles have these beetles having been collected in the mid-1960s. There's no Wikipedia entry for Greta's father, so I don't know when he was born, but assuming that she was, or that he was born a few years before her, these beetles were collected before both of her parents were born, which is, it's funny, I guess is the word I'm looking for. But it's just remarkable that you have somebody who is an incredible voice for activism, who has a beetle named after her, which was collected before her parents were even born, but was not discovered or identified until now. And it's an honor to have something like this named after you. I know that parasitic organisms and things like that have been named after Donald Trump, but Gary Larson of The Far Side, which may be coming back, has a number of insect species named in his honor because scientists are huge fans of his. That's one of the things when I was in college I noticed, you go into the science building and every damned professor and classroom all had Far Side cartoons pinned up on them. Gosh, I'd hate to think that was the high water mark of science fandom in the U.S. Hopefully, it'll come back, and hopefully, the rumors that Larson intends to start doing this cartoon again are true. We'll just have to see. Okay. This is a complicated section, and before I get to the stories I intend to cover in this episode, and I know we're running long, I have to discuss what was one of the largest topics of the past week, and my anger that everyone seems to have missed the real problem with the issue. As you have no doubt heard, a bunch of Republicans made asses out of themselves by storming what's called the SCIF, which is a secure area in the Capitol, and demanding that they be admitted to the closed-door hearings, which many of them could have gone to if they wanted. Everyone has been railing about how this was a clear violation of the law and put national security at risk, but this is akin to complaining that someone is driving around with a taillight out while they've got a dead body in the trunk of their car. Let me explain. The Republicans who had their smartphones with them, whether they used them or not, and whether or not they had them on, did pose a risk to national security by their actions. However, it's a relatively minor one. Assume, for the sake of argument, that the phones all of them were carrying had been hacked by either the Russians or the Chinese or both, and those nations can monitor everything going on using those phones. What would they have gotten? They would have gotten the exact GPS coordinates of the SCIF, something which they probably already had. The SCIF would have shown up on prior maps as a black hole on the map where they didn't have any GPS data. They would have known that this was because the area was a SCIF, and by doing some basic math, they could have figured out the rough dimensions of the size of the place and where it was located in the Capitol building. All bringing the phones into the place would have done was to give a little better precision to the coordinates. And I want to point out that unless you've got a smartphone where you can pull the battery out of the fucker, even when you think it's off, it may not be. It's turned out that some smartphones appear to be off, but they still have background processes running. Hackers could take advantage of this and do things, still gather data, even though it appeared that the phone was off. The phones won't transmit any data gained during that period of time while they're off. However, once you turn that phone back on, they will transmit that data. Given that the Democrats stopped everything when the Republicans showed up, there's little classified information that the Chinese or Russians could have gotten from audio picked up during that time. And what they would have heard probably wasn't nearly as significant as if they'd heard the names of spies or specifics about U.S. military systems or whatever. They would have been able to figure out some things about the dimensions of the area and the things in it by analyzing the differences in the acoustics picked up by the phones in different parts of the SCIF. And I want to point out, you really can't fucking trust the GPS data in smartphones to be all that accurate. My own phone has, and this is, Android phones and iPhones, they've all spit out, there's an app called Swarm, which used to be known as Foursquare, but they forked the thing, and even if you don't have Swarm or Foursquare on your phone, those apps are actually on your phone in the sense that the the location data gathered by many apps uses platforms that the folks behind Swarm and Foursquare developed. So, you don't have to have those things on your phone for them to record your data. And the thing that's happened to me is Swarm says, hey, you forgot to, are you near this location? And I'll look at it and I'll be stunned because it's like the location I'm in is it's asking me if I'm at, is a mile away from where I'm actually am. And it's in an entirely different direction than I've gone that entire day. So it's not like it just now figured out that, hey, I was in this spot and it's asking me if I'm there. The ability of it to pinpoint my location is so poor that it doesn't know where I am a lot of the times, even though it should. So, the GPS data that they got, some of it's going to be garbage. But they still could have used, enough information from that to be able to figure out, okay, this guy is here, this other guy is 10 feet to his right or 20 feet to his left or whatever. And with that information, they could process the audio that, the sound that those phones picked up and gotten some specifics about the room they were in at that time. This is somewhat important since it can help them in trying to place listening devices in the skiff at a future date, assuming they can figure out a way to get them past security. Because if they know that, hey, there's carpeting in this area, we can design a bug or a listening device that can be, has carpeting on one side of it so it can blend in with the carpet or whatever. And it can help them process audio that's garbled. They're like, well, okay, we know what the audio in this area sounds like, so if we've got this distorted audio, we know how to process it to make it more intelligible. But any bugs or such devices that they might manage to get past security would no doubt be found during the routine security sweeps of the area, which are standard practice for such facilities. The photographs tweeted out might yield some details as well, but again, if there were no pictures of classified documents, then it's not a huge security risk. I mean, sure, they can use those images to help them devise better camouflage for their bugs, but it's not anything like handing over the schematics for a new weapon system. The real issue, and no one is talking about this, or if they are, I've not heard about it, is that many Republicans seem to think it was the Democrats who were holding illegal hearings. Now, I'm sure we can all agree that if one party, regardless of which one it was, were holding illegal hearings, the other party would have the right to storm those hearings and demand that they be halted. That's not what happened, though. The Democrats were meticulously following the rules which had been written by the Republicans before the Benghazi hearings, so they were not in violation of the law or the rules of Congress. And I want to point out that closed-door hearings are common in Congress. Back in the late 80s, I saw G. Gordon Liddy speak at the college I was attending, and one of the things that he talked about were closed-door hearings. He claimed, and it is G. Gordon Liddy, the man who got caught because he was too stupid to remember to remove tape from a door after he helped break into Watergate, so I won't blame you if you discount what he said, that one of the reasons for closed-door hearings is not merely so that politicians can question people about classified matters, but so that they can get a feel for the witness before they hold public hearings. That way, the politician is less likely to ask a witness a question that blows up in the politician's face when they're in front of the cameras. It certainly has a ring of truth about it, but given the way some recent televised hearings have gone, I have to wonder if the politicians realize how stupid they sound. The narrative that the Republicans are spinning about the hearings, though, is that they were illegal and the Congress people who stormed them were doing the right thing. No matter what comes out in the impeachment hearings, the Republicans are going to continue to follow that narrative. And given the level of ignorance amongst huge swaths of the American public about how government works, the Republicans are going to be believed. And that's both sides of the political aisle, by the way. That should scare the shit out of you, because this calls into question, at least in the minds of those who believe the Republicans on this, of the whole impeachment inquiry. So it won't matter if the Democrats produce a recording of Trump saying something like, "Even though I gave Putin the full specs of our stealth bombers and the names of 100 spies we have working in Russia, he still won't let me build a hotel in Moscow." They'll just hand-wave it away, complaining that it's a fake or that it doesn't really matter since it was discovered in the course of an illegal investigation and thus is what's known as the fruit of the poisonous tree, meaning it can't be considered as evidence in a legal proceeding if you're in a normal courtroom. Never mind that the rules governing impeachment are different than those used in a court of law. If you've talked to anyone who's deep into the Fox News, Breitbart, or Alex Jones alternative universe, you know that they don't grasp any of this. They think that this is no different than the sit-in which Democrats did on the floor of Congress, not a highly secured area, some time back. And it doesn't matter that this is a small group of people who are incapable of being reasoned with, unlike the vast majority of Americans. I'm sure that we all think if Trump gets impeached and removed from office, many Republicans will say that he deserved it, or, at worst, like Nixon, Trump did what every president does. He was just stupid and got caught. Not true, of course, but that's another matter. We don't know how many Republicans will adopt the attitude that Trump was unfairly and illegally impeached. And we won't know until there's an actual impeachment of Trump. But I'm not worried about them. I'm worried about the folks who are so far gone that they don't accept any narrative which isn't put out by a far-right source, because these people tend to be heavily armed and are more than happy to proclaim their willingness to use violence. Again, how many of them will actually be willing to do so is unknown, but it should still keep you up at night. Yes, the odds that they'd be successful in overthrowing the U.S. government are probably very low, but how many innocent people will die before these idiots are stopped? That's a concern here. And not only will innocent people die, but their deaths could be the trigger effects for larger unrest, as often happens in these types of situations. Che Guevara only became the radical activist that he was after some of his loved ones were killed as a result of a CIA operation. If the government gets ham-fisted in how it handles those engaging in violence against the government, it will only inspire others to engage in violence as well. Some will no doubt go after the insurrectionists, others will go after the government, and some will go after both. That's kind of how shit started in Syria. Additionally, there's the fact that so far, none of the members of the Ukraine clown posse have been charged with violating the law. Not only does this set up the dangerous precedent of encourage them to do the same thing again, it sends a loud signal to those on both sides of the political spectrum that certain people are above the law, further undermining the faith that people have in our government, which puts us closer to civil unrest and civil war. Of course, if those members of Congress are prosecuted for violating the law, they won't simply accept their punishment. they'll immediately ramp up the cries about this whole thing being a coup, further inflaming those on the far right and making it that much likelier that we'll see violence if Trump's impeached and removed from office. Now, there is a chance that the odds of a civil war could be quickly cooled by what comes out during the impeachment hearings. And I cannot believe that I'm saying this, as of right now, it hinges upon what Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, has to say. Bolton is very popular with many on the far right, what with his love of bombing other countries. If he comes out and gives clearly damning testimony against Trump, and it's got to be something like Trump used a flag for toilet paper, it can't be anything complicated like Trump said some things which could be interpreted as him giving classified information to Putin that he shouldn't have, then Bolton will have effectively undercut the coup narrative. It's possible that someone else will say something which makes it indisputable to most folks that Trump was in the wrong, but as of right now, the details we have about the Ukraine business aren't enough to do it. I've been in enough discussions with folks online where Trump supporters come up with the most mind-bendingly bizarre explanations of how Trump saying something doesn't mean what Trump said. It's even more warped and twisted than the things that the White House spits out to defend Trump. And these aren't Russian bots. I've been in groups with these people for over a decade now, so if they're fake accounts, somebody has been playing a very long game. I don't like the thought that we might be on the cusp of a civil war. I want to turn away from it the way religious people do facts proving that there are no gods. But as an atheist and a skeptic, that's not who I should be. I should be someone who examines the facts and makes my decisions based on them. And right now, the fact that there are members of our own government inching us towards a civil war is one that I have to face. And as much as it bothers me that this is happening, it bothers me even more that there's no one in our community who seems to be talking about this. The thread that holds a society together is a very thin one, and when it's cut, atrocities happen. Rwanda was considered a rising star in Africa until the genocide happened. Yugoslavia was heralded as a triumph of unification until the Soviet Union fell and old grievances were fanned. And when I say old, I mean old. They were complaining about shit which had happened 1,000 or more years ago. Kind of makes the folks still grinding an axe about the Civil War seem like pikers. But don't think that the U.S. will fracture if it does along the lines of the old Confederacy. Certainly many of those states will be likely to side with the Trump backers, but a number of other states will no doubt support Trump as well. People like to joke that Montana, which overwhelmingly voted for Trump in 2016, has more cows than people, but they also supply much of the U.S. with beef, and if they refuse to ship it to blue states, people are going to start going hungry. What it will come down to, I think, is, like in 1861, the character of the person who's president. Unfortunately, this time, there will be questions as to who is the president. If Trump is impeached and refuses to be removed, the responses of Mike Pence and Mitch McConnell will be crucial. Ideally, they'd say Trump was crazy and have him arrested, but they might not do that. If they're as tied up in corruption as Trump is, then they would have two options. Throw Trump to the legal system as a sacrifice and hope that this forestalls any investigations into their own actions, or back Trump because they see supporting him as the only way to protect themselves from prosecution. One would like to believe that they have enough sense to recognize that a civil war would be a nightmare for everyone, and even if they knew they'd wind up in jail, they'd take whatever steps necessary to prevent it. Yet we know many of the wealthy have bought up large swaths of land in places like New Zealand and are building compounds to hole up in if society collapses. they might just decide they'd rather bail on the country as a whole and head down there instead of, doing the right thing. New Zealand has made some efforts to counter this, since nobody likes the idea of a bunch of rich bastards holding up in their castles while everybody else starves to death, but I don't know how they'd react to members of the US government fleeing to their country during a civil war. One hopes that they'd tell those folks to go fuck themselves, but I don't know. I know I've got at least one Kiwi listener, so maybe they can weigh in with an answer on the subject. And while this seems dark, don't worry, I'm going to be moving on to happier subjects in a bit. But first, from sfgate.com, Kincaid Fire sends PG&E stock reeling, could go to zero, analyst warns. Pacific Gas and Electric stock tanked Friday following the news that the company equipment on a transmission tower malfunctioned near the origin of the Kincaid Fire in Sonoma County. I'm going to point out Sonoma County, wine country in California. Also, I have to point out that Francis Ford Coppola has a winery in Sonoma County. What does Francis Ford Coppola have in his winery that I might be interested in? He's got a fucking Tucker. Okay, back to the article. Shares fell more than 30% to $5 on worries that potential liabilities from the fire could wipe out investors and scuttle company efforts to emerge from bankruptcy. The stock was selling at nearly $50 a share about a year ago. Citi analyst Praful Mehta said earlier this month that there was a 75% probability PG&E stock would fall to zero. He renewed the call Friday, saying shareholders are worried and should be, Bloomberg reported. PG&E filed for bankruptcy in January as part of a reorganization to deal with the $30 billion in wildfire liabilities resulting from the 2018 Camp Fire, which killed 85 people, burned tens of thousands of homes, and other shit. If the Kincaid Fire is directly linked to PG&E, the reorganization would be further complicated. PG&E said Thursday that a broken jumper cable on a transmission tower was observed amid the response to the fire in North Sonoma County. The problem with the tower was initially disclosed to the California Public Utility Commission in an electronic incident report. In case you haven't heard, California's on fire again, and at least part of the blame for this has to be laid at the feet of PG&E, which, instead of using its profits to upgrade its electrical grid, paid them out to executives and shareholders. There's also plenty of blame to go around for the politicians who refuse to do anything about global warming. It also illustrates the failure of our society to recognize the importance of utilities in modern life. When you open a business, you don't think about the availability of air to breathe because it's ubiquitous, and without it, you don't live. The same is true of electricity today. You don't think about it because it's ubiquitous, and without it, society doesn't function, because since the late 19th century, we've made it an integral part of our society. Take it away, and huge problems develop almost immediately. Even when folks know that it's a temporary solution, not having electricity makes it impossible for much of society to function during the time when the power is out. You might have cash, but there's likely not to be any stores open to buy something from, since without power, their registers won't operate, and they don't have an alternative to recording transactions or make change. Not to mention, they probably don't know how to calculate the proper amount of sales tax for a transaction. That's not a slam on folks who work as cashiers either. I know what my state's sales tax is, but I have no idea what the city or county sales tax might be, or what items it's charged on and what items are exempt from such taxes. I doubt if any of the cashiers in the stores do either. They'll have certainly memorized the after-tax prices for things which are commonly bought, simply due to the amount of repetition of the sales, but that doesn't do you any good if you don't have access to the drawer. So you can't make change, or if someone wants to buy more than just those items whose final prices you happen to memorize. So, okay, you know what the price for a pack of cigarettes is, you know what the price for a gallon of milk is, in both cases after taxes. Somebody buys a gallon of milk, a pack of cigarettes, you can kind of figure that out, but then you throw in them buying, say, a head of lettuce. You don't know what the final price of a head of lettuce is, so you can't figure that out. Then there's the places which sell perishable goods, like fresh food. When I worked at Wally World and the power went off, we had procedures we had to follow in order to try and protect the food once the power went out. For us, this meant wrapping the open refrigerated displays with plastic wrap to try and keep the cold air in if the power went out longer than an hour or so. If we knew there was going to be a long period where we went without power, we'd have to move the food into the coolers into the back of the store, which would stay colder longer. And if the power was out for days, we'd have to throw all that food away. I never dealt with the last part, but I did have to wrap the open coolers with plastic on more than one occasion. And we won't even get into the whole issue about how horrible plastic pollution is right now. Even with scheduled blackouts, it creates problems for businesses and individuals. And scheduled blackouts are what PG&E is doing right now in order to try and prevent forest fires from starting. Companies are going to want to make sure that they have as many employees as possible on staff before and after the power goes out, since not only do they have to deal with a rush of customers trying to get things before the power goes out, or buying the things that they couldn't get while the power was out, but they have to prep the stores for the loss of power and then undo everything so that the store can operate once power is restored. This creates havoc for both the stores and their employees, as the stores have to readjust their scheduling and employees have to deal with things like finding childcare and changing any plans which they might have made. And remember, if the power's out and they know that the power's going to be out, school is not happening. If you're a Wally World employee, well, you're going to be off, so you don't have to find a sitter for your kids. If you're a nurse, works in a hospital, you're still going to have to do your job. And you're going to have to find a sitter for your kid. And that sitter is going to have to keep the kid occupied when there's no fucking power. Now, it is, of course, possible for stores to have backup power systems installed. I know, for example, that the Nissan factory in Tennessee has its own coal-fired power plant on site so that it can generate its own power if it needs to, and a number of companies have taken to installing solar panels on their roofs as a way to help reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, while other companies have backup generators installed. Those solutions are expensive, though solar is rapidly falling in price. I worked for a large multinational corporation which relied heavily on just-in-time delivery methods, and we had massive backup generators. These were nearly the size of a railroad car, but they only provided enough power to keep the computers from shutting down and to run emergency lights in the facilities. They didn't provide enough power to keep us operating as usual. Backup generators are also a terrible solution in terms of the environment. They're not subject to the kinds of clean air regulations that power plants are, even if they do have some pollution controls installed on them. Nor do they generate power from clean sources like hydro, wind, or solar, which at least some of the power provided by PG&E is generated. The backup generators tend to run on diesel, the large ones. The smaller ones may be two-cycle or gasoline or plain gasoline, depending on who made them and other details. And by using generators as backup power sources, businesses are contributing to the very global warming which is causing them to need the generators to begin with. Feedback loop, folks. Feedback loop. Even the governor of California, who has promised to hold PG&E accountable, still doesn't seem to get it, as he's asked Warren Buffett to buy PG&E. This is just fucking stupid. While Warren might be a very wealthy and successful investor, the solution to the problem isn't turning the company over to another capitalist giant like Buffett. It's eliminating the concept of electricity as being something provided by a for-profit entity entirely. Because like healthcare, such a corporation can easily have your ass over a barrel. If you're a business owner, you need electricity to run your business, and you have no choice but to pay what the power company demands. Not to mention, God, we are so long on this episode, but I've got to rant about this. In the 19th century, and before air conditioning was invented, they designed buildings to take advantage of natural cooling. With the advent of air conditioning, those designs went away. So, if you live in, like, my fucking beer can, it gets, I lose power in the summer, it gets real fucking hot in here, I can open all the goddamn windows up, but because it doesn't have natural cooling features about it, it's still going to be warm as shit in here. I have been doing a bit of historical research of late, for reasons Patreon supporters will understand, and one of the things that I've come to realize in doing this research, besides how shitty history is taught in American schools, are the things which drove the U.S. economy to such great heights that we now take for granted or are just ignorant about today. One of the things that was a boon to the U.S. was the introduction of rural free delivery for the mail. Prior to the last decade of the 19th century, if you didn't live in town, and that had to be a town of a significant size, if your town was too small, you didn't have a post office. You would have to travel to the post office to get your mail, or pay someone to bring it to you. You'd also have to go to the post office to send a letter or package. It also meant that businesses weren't likely to expand their operations rapidly, since the Postal Service was a vital way of conducting business back then. There's a reason the Founding Fathers put it into the Constitution that the federal government had to run a postal system. They did this because they knew that having a reliable system of communication for businesses and individuals was a vital service. Had the telegraph existed at that time, they probably would have treated it the same way. Another boon to the U.S. economy was the construction of the interstate road system. While this is credited to Eisenhower, the truth is that the planning for this had begun well before the Second World War. The ability to rapidly and easily ship goods across the U.S. opened up massive opportunity for businesses. Imagine what it would be like if they had to worry if there were roads between their location and where a customer was, or what the toll costs would be if there were only private toll roads between them and their customers. Not to mention the risks of their drivers getting robbed for the sums of money they would have had to carry to travel down those various roads. And the early accounts of cross-country travel by automobile in the U.S. are fascinating because, they'd have a car which could travel, top speed, 40 miles an hour. All right, and you do the math and it works out, well, it should take them, X amount of days to travel across the U.S. At that rate of speed. You add a little more, for them to stop and rest and gas up. And then you look at how long it actually took them. It was considerably longer than that because there weren't paved roads in huge swaths of this country, and there weren't direct routes. You had to, you might want to go here, but in order to get to that destination, you had to go hundreds of miles out of your way to get to this other area, and then switch over to go that way. just, it was an arduous task until we got the interstate system built. Electricity and the internet are comparable technologies today. Having them available and cheap to businesses means we can have a healthy economy. And that means these operations shouldn't be controlled by organizations which are more focused on the size of executive bonuses and turning profits over to the shareholders. Especially since global warming is going to drown a number of cities and burn entire states. Back in about 2005, Scientific American published a plan to get the U.S. on a carbon-neutral economy. I've talked about this before. Had it been adopted, it would have cost roughly what the war in Iraq has, taken about as long, and even if it didn't bring our atmospheric CO2 levels down below what they are now, the fires we're seeing in California wouldn't be happening right now because the bulk of the electrical grid in the state and the rest of the U.S. would be underground. So no sparking transformers or broken power lines to cause fires. Oh, and you'll not hear any of this in the news reports about the California fires. But these fires aren't merely increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, they're also reducing the number of plants which can absorb the CO2. Some studies suggest that trees which are damaged during an event like the California fires will actually release more carbon than they absorb until they recover. If you're not screaming, "Oh shit," at this point, you should be. Because even if we could magically convert everything over to being carbon neutral tomorrow, we've still got billions of tons of excess carbon in the atmosphere which will continue to heat up the planet until we can get the surplus removed. Right now, we're sitting at about 413 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Before the start of the Industrial Revolution, we were at 280 parts per million. That's the number we need to achieve if we want to avoid things getting too hot and shit getting really bad. The 350 parts per million number you hear about is the target we need to hit in order to avoid the worst impacts of global warming. Outside of increasing the number of plants in the world, we don't really have a way to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. People are working on such methods, of course, but nobody has come up with anything that could be deployed on a large scale. Oh, and if anyone's curious, we do have a historical record of global CO2 levels taking a somewhat rapid dive, but the reasons why it happened aren't pretty. When the Europeans arrived in the Americas and the natives died in large numbers due to their lack of immunity to the diseases that the Europeans carried, this enabled the growth of massive forests in the Americas, which sucked so much CO2 out of the atmosphere that the planet cooled a few degrees. Some of you may have heard the claims made by early European explorers of North America that the country was so densely forested that a squirrel could travel across thousands of miles without ever leaving the trees. That was due to the collapse of the native civilizations who used wood for fuel and building materials. Some scientists are uncertain if squirrels were ever found in parts of the United States before the collapse of the Native American civilizations, which happened in the wake of diseases spread by European settlers. I think we can all agree wiping out large numbers of the planet's population is not how we want to deal with global warming. Okay, I won't leave you with such grim ponderings on your mind, and we'll close out on a happier note. If you haven't watched the video of the pallbearer refusing to shake Mitch McConnell's hand at the memorial service in the Capitol for Representative Elijah Cummings of Baltimore, it's in the show notes for this episode, and you have to watch it. It's the funniest damn thing I've seen in ages. The guy's walking along shaking hands with members of Congress when he sees McConnell and immediately skips McConnell to go over to Speaker Pelosi. The look on McConnell's face is fucking priceless, because in that moment there's a flash of recognition that some people don't actually like him and aren't afraid to show it. Senator Chuck Schumer's bemused smirk is also worth a laugh. The man who snubbed McConnell is Bobby Rankin, who was a close friend of Representative Cummings and blames McConnell for his brother not getting his VA benefits before he died. Okay, the raw, unedited file right now is over 2 hours, so it'll shrink when I edit it, hopefully. But I'm going to get out of here, and I will talk to you all next week.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fosnuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.